Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. And as I always say, remember, if you're watching us on YouTube, you can listen to us on all major podcast platforms. And if you're listening to us, you can watch the interviews on YouTube as well. So glad you could join us today. Very glad to bring on our guest. Her name is Margaret Byfield. She is with American Stewards for Liberty. I'm going to read your bio because I don't have it memorized, Margaret. Margaret was raised on a large cow-calf operation in central Nevada. See, I say Nevada, not Nevada, because I know better. She became actively involved in the property rights movement after her parents, Wayne and Jean Hage, filed Hage versus United States in the Federal Court of Claims in 1991. She launched Stewards of the Range in 1992 to help landowners facing similar issues, and that organization was merged into American Stewards of Liberty in 2009. She continues to serve as the executive director of that organization. The organization has been in front of some of the most successful property rights victories since its formation. We're going to talk about that. She holds a bachelor's degree in English and music received from the College of Idaho. She is married to Dan Byfield and has one daughter and 3 stepchildren. So glad you can join us.
Thank you. It is great to be here.
So it's interesting. I'm doing spending a lot of time talking to folks about constitutional issues and a lot of time right now talking about property rights issues. Mm-hmm. Now, I have been accused of having abandoned the property rights movement. For those of you who don't know, I was very active in the property rights movement in the 90s and then sort of was shifted. My focus was shifted in a different direction. But property rights issues hold a very special place in my heart. Let's start here. Let's talk about growing up in central Nevada. Let's talk about your parents' case because, all of these things are personal. All politics is personal, as Newt Gingrich said. Talk about your parents' case and how you got involved in these things.
Well, we purchased a ranch in central Nevada. It's outside of Tonopah, actually between Tonopah and Austin.
Okay.
If you know.
I do.
You know the area.
Weirdly enough, I worked on a case having to do with Nye County being sued by the United States government.
Yes.
So I'm very familiar with Tonopah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very remote. So our ranch house was 60 miles from Tonopah, Nevada.
Okay.
Half of that was dirt road to get into town. And, of course, Tonopah is maybe 4,000, 5,000 people. So very remote area.
Yes.
When we purchased this ranch, the previous owners were selling it because the regulatory pressures were so great.
Yeah.
We thought, because we had a good track record, that we could get along with federal agencies.
Sure.
So in Nevada is 87% federally owned.
Right.
Which means you can't have any kind of an operation there without the federal government being your business partner.
And let's explain also, so was this in Nye County or was this outside of Nye County?
No, it's Nye County.
Okay, so Nye County is the size of Vermont and New Hampshire combined, and it is 93% owned by the federal government.
Yes.
As I remember from my times there. Yes. So everybody just imagine this. Imagine a county the size of 2 eastern states, 93% of which is owned by the federal government. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Margaret.
No, and that's exactly, and you define the problem.
Yeah.
So in that area, we ran on 1,100 square miles. 7,000 of that was private deeded land. Mm-hmm. But typical of a rancher in the West is we owned the water.
Yes.
Now, the conflict really between the federal agencies and us was they wanted the water.
Yes.
The only way they could get it was to clear us off the land. So they did it through their regulatory powers.
Right.
And that's what people don't really understand about the federal government is how much power the administrative state has over the people.
Right.
Thomas Paine, he wrote Common Sense, and he said that one of the arguments for America's independence was because the English Constitution was so convoluted that no ordinary citizen could ever get justice. We are there. We are there in spades.
And the irony is, of course, that one of the reasons why Great Britain left the European Union was because of their regulatory explosion, like 300 regulations to 15,000 in a matter of years. So and so they put the regulatory pressures on you. But this was not strictly what they call a regulatory taking. Or was it strictly a regulatory taking?
It was regulatory and physical because they actually ended up confiscating some of our cattle.
Wow, that's right. That's what I remember from this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me give you an example of some of the pressures that we were under.
Please.
Our first year there, the U.S. Forest Service in a 105-day grazing season served us with 70 visits and 40 certified violations, so certified letters saying of claiming of things that we were doing to violate the terms of our grazing permit.
Got it.
In 105 days, we didn't have time to make that many mistakes.
Sure.
But the problem with the administrative agency is when they make that claim, which is subjective. In
Right,
other
of
words,
course.
it's a BLM or Forest Service employee who decides, I'm going to make these people's lives miserable.
Right.
And they have the regulatory power to do it. Let me give you an example of one of these claims. They said we weren't maintaining our drift fences on Table Mountain. Okay, Table Mountain is 12,000-foot elevation.
Okay.
There's only 3 trails up. It's wilderness. It takes a day to ride up, a day to ride the fence, and a day to come back down.
Wow.
So we're spending, of course, we had to send a man up there to ride the fence and find the problem. He comes down 3 days later, hands Dad a blue flag where they had marked on the fence where the problem was. And Dad said, what was the problem? And they said, well, it was missing 1 staple.
Wow.
And 25 miles of fence. And that was our violation.
And it's we spent a lot of time talking about the work of a man named Henry Silverglade. He wrote a book called 3 Felonies a Day. And it gets into the Soviet communist sort of situation where show me the man and I'll show you the crime. Federal law is so convoluted, it's so vast that if they want to get you for something, they're going to get you for something. That's what happened to your parents.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So we ended up finally, we went through 3 administrative appeals. We won them all. Finally, in 1991, Mom and Dad said, look, we're not going to fight it this way. We're never going to win. So we ended up filing the first federal lands grazing takings case in America.
That's right.
And what they were trying to accomplish was to find out, what do we own? What do we own on these federal lands? Do we own the water right? Do we own the right to graze? Do we own the ditch rights of way? Do we own the range improvements? And that's what they were seeking. So we actually won it at the U.S. Claims Court. We were awarded $14.4 million, and it was physical and regulatory taking. And you might remember this because you were involved at this time. But do you remember 4 months after we filed our case?
Yes.
The Forest Service brought criminal charges against my dad.
Right, that's
do you remember
right.
that?
Yeah, I do remember
Yes.
this. That's right.
Yes.
That's right. And refresh everybody's because I can talk about this, but it's better coming from you. So they filed criminal charges against your dad under remind me.
Well, they claimed he had removed valuable timber from the National Forest.
Yes.
Well, what he had done 2 years prior was clean our ditch rights away, which we had the right to do because we owned them. And he was cleaning out the ditches. And so they came back 2 years later and said he had removed valuable timber from the forest. And the 2 felony charges that they laid on him. He was under house arrest for 6 months. Wow. And this will tell you how nonsensical it was what they were doing. But the Ninth Circuit, the liberal Ninth Circuit, unanimously overturned that conviction 3-0. That's how bad it was.
I remember this, yeah.
Yes. So, so then we advanced with the takings case.
Time out for a second, because I want to humanize this. How old were you at this point?
We filed the case when we bought the ranch when I was 10.
Okay.
So that was 1978.
All right.
We filed the case 20s in my early
20s. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you are someone who you're watching this, you're adult enough to really understand what's going on and to make you angry about this. Anyway, go ahead.
Yes, I think, I saw the injustice.
Yeah.
I saw how ridiculous it was, the things that they were trying to make us do. And you could also see what the purpose was. It was to run the landowner off that land because they wanted the property without having to pay for it.
Yep. And that's very much the case in so many of these property rights cases.
Yes.
That's why, the work that you guys are doing, the work that the other, legal foundations do, because it's only the most well-heeled person that could persevere over the course of a dozen years to press a property rights claim. And again, given the convoluted nature of the courts and the idea of exhausting administrative remedies, it becomes an exercise in just wearing someone down, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And just God bless our attorneys because they hung with us through it all.
Right.
And really never were paid what they never paid what they should have had. But we won the takings case, but then when we got to the D.C. Circuit, they punted. The D.C. Circuit punted, and they decided against our case based on standing and ripeness.
There you go.
Never got to the property rights issues.
That's what I'm talking about here. It's this idea of if the case isn't officially ripe, you haven't exhausted all your administrative remedies, even though it's an exercise in futility. You know where this is going to go. They make you go down this road, and again, it is an education, certainly, in the injustice of how convoluted things can get, isn't it?
Yeah.
So what was the ultimate disposition? Talk about this. I mean, remind us all what happened in the end.
Well, in the end, we lost it all. You know, we lost the case, and then the ranch was foreclosed on.
Right.
You know, which it had to be because there were a lot of expenses attached to that.
Yes.
But so we ended up we just had to walk away from all of it. But my parents, they died before any of this was resolved, so they didn't get to see the finish, which actually was probably a good thing.
Probably a good thing, yeah.
But yeah, you know, I think it really shows you, because I think we had great attorneys on it. I mean, this isn't a case where we went out and we got an attorney who had no experience.
Sure.
We had top takings attorneys on and water attorneys on this case. And I think we had a phenomenal case. We had a great set of facts, but it's so hard to beat the government.
And at that point, especially, the law, the case law was stacked against you guys.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, that's the thing that I think a lot of people also don't understand, is that there had been this body of law that had grown since the late 19th century into the 20th century, in which property rights have been chipped away. I mean, the very concept of regulatory takings was one that had been enunciated in the early 20th century, but then chipped away at over time. To the point where, and I just had this conversation with somebody, you get a case like the Kelo case in 2005. Now, this is the case having to do with eminent domain for private purposes, and you have the Supreme Court essentially relying on prior precedent to say that this poor woman, you know, that it was perfectly acceptable to take her home for a Pfizer parking lot, which they never actually built, which is the damning thing. So let's talk about this. You become active. Mm-hmm. You start doing this kind of work. But obviously the issues don't go away, and in many cases they get worse depending on who is in charge in the federal government. Let's talk about the two big ticket items, right? Let's start with waters of the United States, because so much of this is done out west. So much of this is done in areas where, again, open to interpretation. Something could be a wetland or not a wetland. Talk about where we stand with things, because it keeps going back and forth about the waters of the United States issue.
Well, in the Obama years, he expanded the definition of waters of the U.S., so it was basically regulating a mud hole.
Yeah.
Trump brought that back, made it reasonable. The rule's reasonable. And Biden is back, and he's gone, I think, as far as he thinks he can,
Sure.
the administration can, on expanding the rule back out. And I think really what they've done here is they've made it very unclear as to what applies now.
Right.
But at least now, and as happened in the Obama years, the states have been really good at defending the state water rights. Yeah. So they have stepped in. So I think we now have 28 states that the new rule doesn't apply to because their cases they have an injunction against the rule.
Nice.
So I think, I'm really proud of the states on this, because they have stood up and they've really defended this, and I think that will be well litigated.
That's the importance of the activism in this, and organizations like yours, in terms of pushing through and getting and recognizing that we can fight these things at the state level, because you have to. Now, I want to talk about 30 by 30 times 30. But I want to talk about the ESA as well, the Endangered Species Act, because that is something that hasn't gone away. It's something that a lot of folks don't understand, that it's not about species preservation. It's also about locking up land. Talk about that.
All right. So one of the things we've seen that they are doing differently in the Biden administration is they are listing more species that are ecosystem-wide.
Yeah.
Basically cover more land, regulate more property. Instead of like the little snail that's in 1 mile area of a river, they're now doing, lesser prairie chicken, which covers, I think, 5 states.
Wow.
They're going big species. The other key thing to understand of what particularly the Biden administration is doing, although it's been going on for a while, is they're listing these species based on the impact of climate change.
There you go.
Okay?
Yeah.
So basically, if you take their arguments, every species should be listed on the endangered list, because if you believe climate change is impacting them, it's going to impact every species. This also means none of the species will ever be delisted.
Right, of course. Yes.
So it's just they have weaponized the ESA. I mean, we've been watching this. You know this.
For
30
please explain.
years.
Yes.
For 30 years, they use it against the landowner. I mean, it's a punitive law. The people who take care of their land that have habitat for these species are the ones who are being penalized financially, by not being able to use their land, and criminally, if by chance in their activities they actually harm a species, then it's a felony
God
against
forbid.
them.
And of course, let's remember, the folks need to understand that when you discover that your land might be endangered species habitat, not that there may be an actual species on your property, but that it's habitat, and you want to use that land, you have to file what's called an incidental take permit, which means you are essentially having to admit beforehand that your activity could harm the species. It may not harm the species, but it may incidentally do it. And so the onus is upon you, and then they have the power to approve. I mean, it is amazing to me that folks don't understand the disconnect, the disincentives that are created by this, right? And our friend, we've mentioned him as we were talking before the show, R.J. Smith, has done so much on the private conservation side of this. One would think that if they were, I guess the point is, if they were really interested in species protection, they would go a much different route. But what they're really interested in is controlling land and land use activities, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the ESA has always been about that.
Yep.
That's been the driving force behind it. And so we're just seeing right now, particularly in the Biden administration, they understand it is a weapon that they can use to control more property.
Yeah.
And they're using it.
So let's talk about some of the other successes that you guys have had. Let's talk about the Trans-Texas corridor, because this gets into. I mean, do you want to go there first, or do we want to talk about 30 by 30? Because what we're talking about here, we've already got the problem with the federal government. Then when you enter in the international actors into the mix and the pressures that are then put on, it changes it incredibly. But let's start with the Trans-Texas corridor, because I think explain the issue for folks.
Sure. So this is a corridor that was advanced by our then Governor Perry.
Yeah.
And it was a quarter of a mile wide corridor that was going to go through Texas, take 500,000 acres. 500,000 acres of private land for this corridor. Now, the Trans-Texas corridor was the first link in the NAFTA superhighway, is what it was known, if you remember that.
Sure.
And there were about 5 corridors, and this Trans-Texas corridor was going to be the first leg. Now, what this did was it connected the Chinese-owned ports in Mexico.
Sure.
All the way through America. The first real border security was going to take place in Kansas City with a smart scan, and then go all the way up to Canada.
Wow.
It was to increase trade in America, make it easier for trade. We were very concerned because obviously the property rights problems with it, but also because we knew the goods from China were going to be offloaded in their own ports in Mexico, not inspected, never inspected until they were in the middle of our country.
Right.
That was very concerning even back then.
You know, it's interesting because spent a lot of time over the last few years talking about our friends in the small L, I'm not even going to say the small L libertarian movement, the free market limited government movement, who don't quite understand that we may have been sold a bill of goods. Listen, freer trade is a good thing. Free market economies are a good thing. But there are impacts to American society that we have to realize. It's the same folks. We had a conversation a few months ago about the Jones Act with people about that, and a lot of folks don't understand the national security angles that are at work here. The idea that you could load up a truck in Mexico in a Chinese-owned port with Chinese-owned goods and have it transported and it can get all the way to Kansas City before it's checked, there's something that I find a little disconcerting about that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And we did too. So unfortunately or fortunately, this road was going to go a quarter of a mile from Dan's and my home. Which meant we had to get involved.
Wow, sure, yeah.
So, sometimes God has a hand
of course.
in putting people where he wants them. We use something in the West to help fight the federal agencies from taking property and from regulating the land to where we can't use it. And it's a process called coordination, where the federal agencies are actually required to coordinate with local governments. And they don't ever do it unless the counties require them to do that. Now, we also have a statute very similar in Texas that requires the state agencies to do that.
Nice.
So what we did on the Trans-Texas corridor was organize the right groups to require that coordination with the Texas Department of Transportation.
Nice.
And then we also looked at the National Environmental Policy Act, and we pointed out all the flaws. So the National Environmental Policy Act, which is the environmentalist tool to shut us down, the productive uses down, we use it against them.
Sure, good.
And we used
As
it
you
against
should.
them in the Trans-Texas Corridor, and we pointed out all of the failings of the things that they weren't considering under that NEPA. We ended up, we fought that for 27 months. Wow. We brought in TxDOT, CEQ, EPA actually ended up being a friend for us in that issue. And Fish and Wildlife Service, we brought them all in to coordinate on that and then made our case and showed their failings. And they eventually, Federal Highway Administration issued a no-build order on that.
There you go.
Because it failed the environmental clearance, which is what we raised.
It goes to show when you use their tactics against them, you can have great results and great impact. And we need to be doing more of this. Listen, this is part of the reason why the folks at CEI and the Center for Private Conservation were doing that work, because they wanted to make the demonstration as to why the Endangered Species Act was a wrong-headed bill. So this is, anytime you create these sort of perverse disincentives. So now let's sort of get into the meat of it, which is the pressing issue, which is 30 by 30. Is this what we're calling it?
30 by 30.
30 by 30.
That's what the environmentalists labeled it.
Yeah.
It was 30 by 30. So we started seeing articles come out on it during the election.
All right.
And it's what the environmentalists were talking about. Of course, after studying them for 30 years and watching them and fighting them, we knew that 30 by 30 was going to be a big issue for this administration.
Yes.
So we dug into it, learned about it, understood it. And so when it was launched through the Climate Crisis Executive Order, January 27th of 2021, 6 days into his administration, there it was, 57 pages executive order, 2 paragraphs talking about the need to conserve 30% of America's land.
Wow.
I should say at least 30% of America's land by 2030.
All right, but okay, so let's think about this, because we're finally at a place where we're supposed to be doing an actual inventory of the property that the federal government owns. And for those of you who don't know this, up until now, we just don't know how much land the federal government owns. It was one of those things that I was pushing for years ago, back when I was working for NFIB. And we're finally sort of getting to that point. Mm-hmm. So without knowing how much land the federal government owns, we're pushing for this. But what do we suspect? I mean, how much land does the federal government, and this is own, control, what? Because there's a whole other aspect to this. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So first off, they say conserve, but what they mean by conserve is permanently protect.
Right.
The first thing you have to understand is this is not an American agenda. This is an international agenda.
Yes.
And they are implementing this in other nations. They're much further ahead than they are in America. And the reason is because in America, the people own the land still.
Right.
At least 60% of the land.
Okay.
So government owns, between federal, state, and local, owns about 40% of America right now.
Okay.
The federal government, we think, and because you're exactly right, we really don't know, they don't know, we think they own about 27% of America's land. Now, what they say meets the definition when they first came out, because as you know, they now are hiding the ball and they say we don't know how to define it.
Yes.
But when they first launched 30 by 30, they said in a Department of Interior fact sheet on 14008 that currently 12% of America's land is permanently protected.
Oh, okay.
And we know what that 12% is.
All right.
That 12% comes from the USGS gap analysis.
All right.
They took Category 1 and Category 2. Those lands are national parks, wilderness, private lands with conservation easements in perpetuity.
Right. So this gets at, and a lot of folks don't understand this, and I think it's important to explain. So you have, because everybody thinks of things like the National Forest. In fact, I had this conversation with Helen Chenoweth at one point with R.J. Smith, and I made this point to her. Helen Chenoweth was Congresswoman from Idaho and a stalwart of property rights, and a lot of folks don't understand there's a reason why the national forest land is managed by the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, whereas national parks are managed by the Department of the Interior. And it's because Forest Service land is supposed to be managed and utilized for timber production. We don't do that anymore. It's supposed to be that way, but that's why it was set up that way. And then you have, of course, the Bureau of Land Management land, which is supposed to be used for grazing and resource extraction, et cetera, et cetera. But again, they want to lock that up. So essentially if I'm understanding this correctly, some of it is about acquisition, but more of it is about converting the lands that are being used for resource extraction and production into permanent protection. And am I understanding that correctly, or is it a little bit more? Is it a little bit different than that?
Yeah, one of the basis for 30 by 30 is they make this grand claim that 1 million species are going to go extinct in the coming decade if we don't do this.
Oh,
so
of course,
it's for
yes.
habitat.
Right.
So that's the other thing that they're
got
after. That's why they're after the private lands, because your best lands in America are the ones that are privately owned and privately cared for. The landowner lives on the land, benefits from the land.
It's the tragedy of the commons.
Has to make sure that land produces well.
Do me a favor and explain the concept of the tragedy of the commons to our viewers and listeners, because I think they need to understand this as sort of an economic precept in terms of property rights and land preservation. Talk about this.
Well, I think the way that I like to explain this is if you have 100,000 acres owned by 40 people.
Right.
And one landowner does something that is wrong with the land, doesn't take care of it well.
Yeah.
That affects one little part of that land.
Sure.
If you have 100,000 acres owned and controlled by one entity that makes a mistake or bad policy decisions, it destroys all that land.
That's how you get massive forest fires, that destroy everything.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's not really tragedy of the commons, but that is the model for 30 by 30.
Right.
That is what they want. They want to extinguish that private landowner. And that is putting the hands of our lands into a scenario that is going to destroy everything that they say that they're going to keep.
It's interesting because I had a conversation this morning with somebody about things that we've learned over the years. We've made mistakes over time because we don't understand or know how things go. I had thought, at least for a time, that we had learned understood the problems of the tragedy of the commons and was doing more. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, and we can, we don't need to argue back and forth about the catch shares program and the concept of individual fishing quotas. The idea of, applying a private property rights scenario to commonly held fish stocks in the world's oceans. But at least, they're trying to apply a property rights model to things. You can talk about some of the other issues that are out there. This seems to be a giant step backwards that we haven't learned about private conservation and what that can do and how that can protect species. Why have we am I right in thinking that because it's really not about species preservation, but it's about land control above all else? Okay.
Yes, this is not about conservation. It's about control. Yeah. Absolutely. That's what 30 by 30 is about. If you think about what Karl Marx said, how did he define socialism? Abolition of private property.
Absolutely.
They understand that. The people really pushing this agenda don't believe in property rights.
Right.
They don't believe people should own anything. They also think nature should have equal rights to people.
Yeah.
It's a very radical perspective, but it is what's driving the 30 by 30 agenda.
Listen, it's one of those things where the one Dr. Seuss book I would not allow my kids to have was The Lorax. Because I said, something, who let this little, first of all, right, for those of you unfamiliar, you're familiar with The Lorax? Mm-hmm. The Lorax is a book written by Dr. Seuss, and it posits a world in which there are these things called truffula trees. Mm-hmm. And the people of this society, they love the truffula nuts and the truffula trees, and they cut them all down. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, well, if somebody privately owned them, it turns it all on its head. If someone owned the truffula trees, they would maximize the production of truffula trees and truffula nuts.
Exactly.
So you would never run out. It's the reason why we have, as other folks have pointed out, we have an overabundance. Actually, not anymore. We don't have an overabundance of cows anymore. We got plenty of cows in the country producing milk and producing beef. But we've had a shortage of buffalo because people could go out on the range and just kill buffalo willy-nilly. But if you did that to cows, you would be hung, and rightly so. That's what we're getting at here. It's funny because we talk about the other parts of this, which are, we surmise, we posit that the left wants to move people off the range into cities, get them out of their cars, get them into public transportation, just get them as sort of cogs in this widget. And it's amazing to me, one of the things that never ceased to amaze me was the folks on the coastal elites who sort of look at the flyover states, especially the western states, and I obviously don't consider them flyover states, but look at the western states, and they like the idea of these things being locked up, but they don't understand what happens when you don't cut timber on national forest lands. They don't understand when you don't have cattle grazing out there or what have you. Talk a little bit about this disconnect and what is driving this on the part of, but besides the socialists that are out there, but the environmental movement generally.
Yeah, it's really just misinformed. They have no body of reference. You take a private landowner. for instance, how do they manage their land?
Yeah.
Let's say an invasive weed starts growing up in
Sure.
one of their creeks. Well, they're going to go out there and they're going to take a shovel and they're going to get rid of it.
Right. The
Problem solved.
shoot, shovel, and shut up syndrome.
When the government owns it,
Yeah.
then you have to get a permit, and that's going to take 18 months to get. You might have to do an EIS or an environmental assessment to
Right.
make sure that you can actually go out there and take care of that invasive weed. And by the time you go and you are permitted to go out there and solve the problem, 2 years down the road, now you need a backhoe.
Right.
And you've got to dig up a whole bunch of land in order to take care of it. That's what we're talking about. That's the kind of management that they are seeking.
Let's bring it back to the Nye counties of the world, or the Tombstone, Arizonas of the world, and counties in which you have people living in private lands that are surrounded by federal property. So you got a county like Nye County that can't, and this was an early 90s situation, they could do it with cell phone service now, that couldn't string a telephone wire from the main line over to their the public dump, right, across 100 yards of federal land without going through this whole process.
Right.
You had, I think it was Tombstone, Arizona, where they lost their access to their water. And they had this was I think the bucket brigade. I may be messing up the cities, but it was this idea of, because they had to cross Arizona, federally owned wilderness in Arizona, to reconnect the pipes. They couldn't do that. This 30 by 30 really has the impact of drying, in a very little sense, drying up these small towns that are surrounded by federal property, aren't they?
Oh, it's absolutely. That is absolutely the goal.
Yeah.
I mean, by getting rid of the productive use of these lands, they get rid of the communities, and they force everybody into cities, and they allow these areas to be cared for in their natural condition, which means no management, which is not good conservation. But it's really not about that. And this is something, if you ever met my dad, I don't know if you ever met him.
I don't think I did, no.
But one of the things he said early on in our battle was, it's not about whether or not we're going to use the resources. It's about who is going to use the resources.
Absolutely. This is where I was getting to,
30 by 30 is about clearing the title.
Okay.
That's what 30 by, I mean, if you want to just break it down to the bottom line, it's about clearing the title. Now, to get there, they're telling people this is just about conservation. And this is voluntary.
Hold on for a second.
Driven.
I think we need to explain this concept, because a lot of folks don't understand. When you clear title, it means that the other owners are out. It means that the entity, the controlling entity, usually some government entity, whether it's a state government or the federal government, they have the title to this, and they can then turn around and dispose of the property freely without any encumbrances. Is that am I right here?
Either dispose or determine who gets to use it. Pick the winners or users.
Yes.
Losers of it, because when you have a property right, you have a right to be out there.
Yes, of course.
So they've got to get rid of that so they can decide, is it going to be China that's going to mine it?
Right.
Is it going to be Spain that's going to have the timber contract? Who's going to be able to do that?
So much of this comes down to, and so much of what this administration is doing comes down to this issue of kleptocracy. Because the more you gin the system, and the more complicated you make the system, and the more the government has the ability to pick winners and losers, the greater the ability for that government to be bought off. And that's part of what you're talking about here, is this idea of whether it's a national entity, China, Spain, whomever, or a private entity, some major multinational corporation which has a connection to the family that's in charge. That's where we go. That's a very dangerous situation. Setting aside the property rights issues and the sovereignty issues, it's a dangerous area for any people to be in, I would think.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And, we need to get back to what our founders understood. Sure. Because our founders, if you remember, and I know you do, that they did not set up the federal government to own land.
Right.
They were just to dispose of the land.
Absolutely.
So when Jefferson made the Louisiana Purchase, which was about 540 million acres, what did they do? They opened that up to settlement. So depending on which Homestead Act was operating in the different states, you could go out and you could stake 120 acres or 640 acres. That was your homestead.
Right.
That is what built the middle class in America. But what our founders understood, a lot of people think, well, we protect our constitutional rights because we have the Bill of Rights.
Yep.
Or we protect them because we have the gun right.
Yep.
Or we protect them because we have freedom of speech. No. We protect all those things because we, the people, own the land.
Absolutely.
We own the natural resource wealth of this nation. And when we own a piece of land, that means we can grow our own food.
Right.
We can make our own income. We can help make a good local economy strong, which then makes a national economy
100%.
strong. And we control the wealth of the nation because we, the people, have it, which means we can limit our government and we get to enjoy the individual liberties. That is what protects the Constitution and all of those rights.
It's interesting because I had a conversation yesterday on the air with somebody about the issue of empowerment versus disempowerment. One side in our philosophical fight wants to empower people to act on their own behalf.
Yes.
Whether it is self-defense or whether it is property rights, whether it is a whole host of things, there's another side that wants to disempower people to act on their own behalf and get them to become, wards of the government in whatever, cradle to grave healthcare, wraparound educational services, wraparound childcare services, wraparound transportation services. And that's not the way it was supposed to be. It's interesting because you go through and there's a reason why land east of the Mississippi has very little federal land ownership, and then west of the Mississippi, a lot of it is still in federal hands because you go through the state enabling acts, and the federal government retained that land.
That's right.
A lot of folks don't know that in most of those state enabling acts, the federal government promised to dispose of that land, and then that changed, and some of it changed because they didn't know, what resources could be found on it. And then it all came to a halt with the Federal Land Policy Management Act of 1979. And I submit that part of the reason why we have so much, part of the reason why we have federal deficits is because we're no longer selling land and leasing it out in a way that is productive. So this is the big battle. What is the battleground upon which 30 by 30 is being waged right now? How do folks get involved in that? What do they do? I know you guys did a series of events last year. You had a big summit. What are you guys doing this year? How are folks getting involved?
So we are going to have another summit this year. It'll be September 21st through the 23rd in Dallas, Texas
Excellent.
this time. Last year, Governor Ricketts, who's now Senator Ricketts, was our host.
Excellent.
We had it in Lincoln, Nebraska. It was a great summit.
Yeah.
People from 22 states came and attended that. And it's with a lot of policymakers. So
Good.
We're hoping that that's going to be what we do again this year. We're expanding it to 2 days. That's going to be great. That's going to be a good opportunity to learn what's going on 30 by 30 and how to fight it. So, all of these issues, what they're doing here in Washington, D.C., every one of these policies is implemented on the ground.
Got it.
So the battle is being waged on the ground,
Okay.
out in the grassroots in every county across America. The Biden administration, this is not an authorized program.
Yes.
Okay, there's no congressional approval or constitutional
This is
approval.
important. Yes.
It's being done by the Biden administration without any kind of authorization. So what they've done is they've taken existing programs,
Sure.
like ESA, like the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, where they control so much of the federal lands, and they're using those authorities
Sure.
to get to their 30 by 30 target. So where they can restrict land here, restrict land there, doing different things, giving money, grants for conservation easements to get that easement on the private land, which is really important to get towards to the 30 by 30. There's all kind of programs that they're doing to implement this on the ground, and that's really where we're fighting it. That's where the ground war is. We have over 160 counties, and I know it's higher than that. I just haven't counted recently.
Yeah.
That have passed resolutions to oppose 30 by 30.
Good.
And that was an important statement for counties to make because the Biden administration keeps telling everybody this is locally led,
Sure.
voluntary conservation programs, and it's not.
Yeah,
This is being thrust on these little communities.
And the problem, of course, is that normally we would say that if something is implemented via executive order, it can be undone. But if the executive order is driving regulatory practice, and that regulatory practice is driving things like conservation easements, it becomes harder than a tick to get unstuck.
Right.
Yeah, that's the issue. So let me pull it back a little bit, and I warned you in advance I was going to ask you about this. And it sounds to me, and I get this. This is an all-consuming passion for you, and there's a reason for it because you've grown up with this. It's your life's calling. Obviously, you do stuff that's outside of this. Talk a little bit about your family, or the outside interest, as I call it.
Well, probably our greatest outside interest is tennis.
Okay. Yeah.
So, as you know, my husband,
Yeah.
and he played tennis for the University of Texas.
Excellent.
And we have a daughter who is tall like him. She's 6'1".
Wow.
And she's playing tennis for Sam Houston State. So we have 2 college players in the family.
That's awesome.
So that did rub off on me a little bit. And Dan
good.
started me playing tennis. So I hadn't picked up a racket till I was 40 years old. And it's one of those games you start playing and it's so much fun.
That's good.
But I do say my husband and daughter, they play tennis and I play at tennis.
Sure. Let me ask you this. I meant to say this because you grew up in Nevada. You grew up doing the ranching thing, riding horses and all the great stuff. Are you a little bit buoyed by the Taylor Sheridan culture, the Yellowstone culture? Sort of, is that bringing any of the stuff more to the forefront, or is it helping? Is it hurting?
You know, I don't watch the program.
Okay.
I tried a few episodes and I thought, I'm sorry, but when we were on the ranch, we didn't wear this much jewelry.
Sure, of course, yes.
Riding
Yeah, of
horses
course.
and all the wealth. So, our operation was very old-fashioned because
Yeah.
we were so remote. An average ride for us was 25 miles a day.
Yeah.
That's really unheard of still
Sure.
today. So just saw it differently. So it's not something I've really liked.
It's interesting
but-
because it got me hooked very early on when in the very first episode, one of the characters was pressing against an eminent domain claim in
Yeah.
the Montana State Supreme Court. So I was like, all right, I'm all in on this. Well, how do folks find out more about the good work that you guys are doing?
Well, our website is americanstewards.us, and that's a good place to go to start learning about us. Sign up for our newsletter. We do a Liberty Matters news service every 2 weeks, and that's really where we keep people updated on what's going on in the property rights movement and 30 by 30 specifically.
Yes.
We are helping, where it's cropping up in different states. We do state alerts.
Good.
So make sure you put in your state so we can contact you when those things come up. And that's a good way to just get involved and get plugged into what we're doing. Property rights is really the key to our freedom in
100%.
America.
Yes.
And what I'm hoping is that we're going to start seeing a revival of understanding of how important that is. Today, our children are not being taught
Right.
about property rights. They're not being taught American history. So we have to do it.
Without a doubt, 100%, they're being taught just the opposite. Margaret Byfield, American Stewards for Liberty, thank you so very much for joining us today. Join Margaret and American Stewards for Liberty in September in Dallas, Texas for their 30 by 30 summit. This has been another episode of The Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I've been your host, Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.